ready for takeoff.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to RubyConf. Thank you for being here to listen to Ruby Archaeology, Forgotten Web Frameworks. I'm your host today, Nick Schwaderer. And I just thought as a little warm-up, you might be jet-lagged like me. I'm 6 time zones away. Everything's messed up. Sometimes people do stretches or whatever to keep you awake through the morning before lunch. So I'm going to do a little thing here. I've noticed that the sound leaks a little, room to room. So if a loud thing happens, the other rooms can hear it. So I thought maybe we should make all the other speakers feel a little intimidated because of how much fun we're having. So I'm gonna ask you to laugh as loud as you can. I know you have a mask on and all that stuff, but we'll be safe about it. So on the count of 3, I want you to go like, ha, 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 all together, if that's all right. 1, 2, 3. Oh, that's a great speaker. Look at that. All right. What I'm here to talk about is Ruby Archaeology by a specific brand, which is about frameworks, they're web frameworks written in Ruby that I think are genuinely forgotten. I do say I'm a production engineer at Shopify on the Ruby and Rails infrastructure team, and I'm really grateful to be able to do this. This isn't like my Shopify work. This is like a lot of us, our productive chaos time or our passion projects or our hobbies, which a lot of times do feed into our day-to-day work. I have an interest in Ruby history. For about 4 or 5 years, I've been doing the Past Rubies newsletter at pastrubies.live, and it's not a week-to-week thing. It's if you're intimidated about content creation and think I can't do something every week, do what I do seasons, like a TV show. Just if you want to do 6 weeks a year where you make this content you're interested in, but then you can live your life, or maybe 8, 10, 12 weeks. And it's been a way that I can, get obsessed with what's happening in Ruby this week 15 years ago, and then do that for a month and a half, and then not feel like it becomes a shackle on my shoulder. So I encourage a lot of you all to make great content. I think that's a wonderful way to just kind of keep it fresh. And also my subscribers kind of like that they aren't getting spammed all the time. And I'm also interested in reviving old Ruby gems and old Ruby patterns that should still be used today. Because if you've started Ruby in the last few years, we have very good linting and things like that and agreed conventions. But Ruby is a sharp knife, and there's a lot that we can do to it. And I'd like to say thank you. Thank you to Shopify for sending me here, for sponsoring in a way the work that I get to do and the work that is done by the infrastructure team on Ruby. Thank you for allowing me to dig through the dusty archives to look at old Ruby code. Thank you to all of you, the community, for being amazing. What Matt said this morning about Ruby's greatest wealth being the people in the community, that resonates with me absolutely 100%. So have to say it, Matt's is nice and so we are nice. There's just something that kind of goes through the community throughout time. The only other corporate thing I'll say is at the Shopify booth, there will be a Ruby coding challenge every day. I may have had a hand in it, and there may be a leaderboard involved. So if you want to go by and it's via the QR code and have a look. If you hate the challenge, it wasn't me, and I had nothing to do with it. But if you like the challenge and think, wow, this is kind of fun, this is a great way to compete with different benchmarks every day, by the way, then it absolutely was me. What am I actually here to talk about, though? None of this. In the 2000s, everyone was writing a Ruby web framework. So this was picked up. I've done a few talks on specific gems from the past. I've done newsletters about blogs and talks. So I've watched a lot of RubyConf, 2006, 7, 8, things like that, and saw what was going on in the community. And this thing that kind of inspired this talk is there's a lot of Ruby web frameworks, and a lot of them that I reckon are forgotten. I ran this list by, I don't know if I can say his name. I don't know if he's in here. By Aaron Patterson, and he remembered 1. So that was like my metric for are these actually forgotten? But this is also quite interesting because these were the days really early on where you couldn't necessarily get a paid job writing Ruby, but people were really excited about it. Only a few years, or maybe within a year of the Pickaxe book first coming out and introducing all this Ruby to us outside of Japan. And people would debate these design patterns and configurations, modularization, conventions, and what would be the Ruby way to write the web. So what I'm looking to achieve today is I want to have a higher level discussion about these frameworks. I want to remind, so I'm not actually saying I'm going to get code from 2002 and run it on an M1, which I usually like to do, but I'm just going to talk about the frameworks and what they brought to Ruby. I want to remind people that there was a time when everyone was seriously experimenting with these and that we should take that same experimenting spirit into the future. I'll do this by talking you through 3 frameworks and 1 standard library gem that I think have been forgotten. The first one's maybe not forgotten, but worth looking at. So let's kick this off. CGI. You might be familiar with CGI, or if you're not, this is an all-access talk. The Common Gateway Interface is a set of standards that define how information is exchanged between a web server and a custom script. And there's a simple way to think about this, if you're not familiar, is you've probably heard of Rack, writing your own Ruby framework sitting on top of Rack. CGI is a bit lower level alternative that people were using before Rails became ubiquitous, and it was a standard that you can install on your Unix system, and it defines how your scripts can talk to these HTTP requests. And because of this, in the Ruby standard library, you have the CGI gem, which you can use to this day, or the TLDR is another Rubyism that we got from Perl Magic before that was available there. But let's have a raw look at this, actually from the documentation. So as simple as it gets, a couple of puts, and that's it. You've now got an actual Ruby-based website working here. But of course, there's, like with anything, there's extra syntactic sugar that you can add. You can actually go CGI.header. You can start writing a bit more interesting HTML. And then kind of similar, if people remember Markaby, or even what's being done today with Flex, where you have the actual Ruby-style methods and then blocks passed to those methods. And I also love, old school multi-line curlies. That's a different discussion. This looks quite neat. And it was actually used. This is an excerpt from Kirk Haynes. I don't know if he's come to RubyConf. I know he spoke at Mini. We've tweeted each other, so if you're in here, Kirk, okay. That'd be my first time meeting him, but we talk a lot. But he's the Iowa maintainer, which is, I'm not covering today, but it was a Ruby web framework from 2001, and it's still there. And when he was talking about coming to Iowa, he referenced CGI.rb, and even though he didn't like it, it was thought of as a common way to web with Ruby. It was an option, as something that you could put on your server. So you can legitimately do this today. You just need to configure this along with a server like Apache on a Unix system. And from here, your only limits are just raw Ruby. As with anything else, this is bare metal enough. You are quite limited to have to roll everything yourself. And it would be fun for a sandbox project, but definitely not something I'd see as a viable solution for me, unless I was just trying to sneak some Ruby on a lightweight handler for requests on a server. So let's go to our first full-fledged framework, Nitro. Put your hand up if you've heard of Nitro. Hey, my friends. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. I'll tell you what Nitro is not. It's not rocket science. So here's an image from the Nitro days from their website, and it provides everything you need to create Web 2.0 applications with ease and joy. There's some beautiful marketing along with it. It inspired a lot of future frameworks. It was first released in October 2004 by George Moscovitis and Trans. George is not in this room, right? Because I saw 2 hands, so it might actually, this has happened before where I've talked about code and then the maintainer. Okay. And the other maintainer was called Trans. I don't know who Trans is. Maybe somebody in here does. But this was the day when you could have your moniker be who you were. Why the Lucky Stiff was why the Lucky Stiff. Mental Guy was Mental Guy. And I think Trans was similarly just Trans. You could go speak at a conference under your moniker. And I don't think you could achieve that anymore. But I think that's one of the cool artifacts from this period of history. But asking what it is, looking at the documentation, it sold itself very high. It had a lot of references here to kind of marketing itself as like a business class top tier framework using terms like rapid application development, efficient API, a layer of DSLs implemented on Ruby, the most powerful object relational mapping solution in the world. It's Web 2 ready, it supports AJAX, XML, standards compliant, is hitting all the buzzwords for the time. But another way to kind of see how the community was reacting, and I believe all of Ruby Talk is on Discourse now. This is where I do some of the research. And it's such a great way because people really used it to debate, particularly then, and say what their opinions were. So if you're doing archaeology, definitely type in your buzzwords into the discourse for Ruby Talk. But a few snippets from this that was from James Britt in July of 2006 is it was seen on a similar tier as Rails. So if you're serious about web development in Ruby, and this is in 2006, you owe it to yourself to spend time with Nitro, Iowa, Rails, and We. And somebody tweeted me today saying if I was going to talk about We. Unfortunately not, but We was another one on the list. From their formal documentation, it consists of 4 libraries and 1 dependency. So raw, which is really the thing. They like to break things up. You can kind of think like how nowadays there's RSpec core, or with merb, there was merb core. Well, there was raw, which was the thinnest amount that you could have to be the full web application. There was OG, which was the object relational mapping and object lifecycle manager, but it also listed facets and jQuery, which is quite interesting to me because they're just external dependencies. If you haven't heard of facets, is a popular gem to add cool things to Ruby, maybe like pre-active support days and stuff, and in a lot of ways that people wanted to write Ruby, you'd often see requiring facets, which was that set of features. And jQuery, you know, I mean, you wouldn't write a web framework that says it comes with jQuery, but this was a different time. So really what, for our purposes, we're thinking about raw and OG. And one remarkable part of this is it was predated rack. So it actually does reference things like CGI throughout its code. This is the only code base that will not be rack-based for the rest of the presentation. If you want to look at that, look at this code base. Additional proclaimed features that it had is you could write your app as you wanted. It said, and I can't quite prove this, that if you wrote in a PHP style, it would automatically transform into Ruby code by Nitro. Or you could choose a traditionally MVC pattern. It took extreme care to not be opinionated and be very much opinion over convention. I don't say configuration over convention because I'm unsure if it had a prohibitive amount of configuration. It just was, what's your opinion on how you should approach building a web framework? It also supported fragmented and action-based templates that would support componentization, and it additionally supported including those fragments at compile time or runtime. It also used DRB quite a bit to provide distributed sessions when running your application over a server cluster. And it also had alleged, I'll cover that in a minute, scaffolding mechanisms to speed up development. I'm gonna stop everything here. I wanna focus on OG though for a minute. That was the second bullet point, is the most interesting part to me. OG, it's the ORM. You know, it's the way that you're going to deal with your objects that are persisted with this, but really what it tried to achieve, in my interpretation, is like how bare metal can we be about you just write your Ruby and we'll give you the SQL. We'll give you the migrations, we'll give you the back end. You don't really have to think about it. This is like conceptual compression on steroids here. This is an object in Nitro at this time, one way that you could write it. And really the only difference is you're passing a type to body. You're saying this will be a string, and then you have your 2s here, so you want the stringified return to be. But it would actually infer everything else for you. It would look at your Ruby code, go through all your classes, and do this. And then you could do a bit more, so you could do like a has many and point that to a class. You could have a uniqueness validation. And all the setup required was a simple config hash where you can see very boring basic parameters here, and then you just do og.setup and pass in the config. End of story. And it created a schema on OG setup. If one existed, you know, it would connect to it and it would transform it from what it had been to what your new Ruby code is now, which is a bit unbelievable. Like it involved, like it had things like evolving, it had things like column addition and removal, renaming. You didn't have to tell it anything. You just changed your Ruby objects and it changed your database for you, which is wild. Right? We think about, oh, I don't have to write raw SQL, cool. What if you didn't have to like do anything? Is this feasible, scalable, or sane? I'm not exactly sure on that. I think what I can tell you is this compression I love. You know, you can write your vanilla Ruby objects with a tiny bit of extra information, and typing, and boom, there it goes. I feel like there's so many issues that you'd encounter. It's like even with people who use like Active Record as their ORM, you run into limits trying to run a business using that, and then you're having to do your own things like your raw SQL at some points, or people who reach for AREL and stuff like that. But I think if you were on a very vanilla like CRUD situation with your application, this is an interesting possibility. One of the problems with Nitro in particular is this is like pre-Twitter, this is all the websites that reference it are down. Getting good examples for it is very difficult. A lot of the blogs that talked about it aren't even on archive.org. All the old commits for it from back in the day, I mean, there's 4 commits left that are on GitHub because, again, because of how old some of the original code is. You can get it now, but I wanted to look at some of the original commits. It's quite challenging. If anyone has info to help me with that, please DM me after. But I did find a Hello World document, which was pretty small here. And we could also find a file structure for a blog example where we could see a directory structure, which doesn't really have anything fascinating, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. The same with the controllers. It's, again, not rewriting the world. We're going to see that theme through this talk, that there are certain areas of Ruby web frameworks that aren't vastly different generally. And the templating supported the partials, it had its own markup. But I started to run into a few things. I said about scaffolding and a lot of big promises and couldn't find necessarily all of the features that were marketed in the older documentation. So it has a lot of powerful concepts. It is heavily limited if you want to use it to being tied to Ruby 1.8.2. So you'd need very specific tooling to be able to use it. I've done things like this, so I believe it is possible. But if you're on an M1 as well, so you might be spinning up something in the cloud. I think OG is worth a second look in 2022. I haven't been able to get it to persist a whole database yet. But I think if I were going to work on one thing after this talk, it would be OG. All of its promises, it was quite hard to surface some of them. I talked a lot about the different types of history that I wasn't able to find code that would align with what was being said in the documentation, which is a shame. The mailing list seemed really active for about 4 years, which is a long time in Ruby terms, and people were using this framework. This was a heavily used and inspirational thing for a lot of what we use today. So for the purpose of a future talk, if somebody wanted to just spend all their time on this, I think that could be a standalone talk. But this is all okay, because Nitro laid the groundwork and inspiration for our next framework we're going to explore, which is very much more documented and preserved in 2022, Ruby Waves. Show of hands, anybody heard of Ruby Waves in here? All right, okay, it's the same. I will come up here, I'll talk to you after. Some of the screenshots are going to be from a RubyConf talk, so it'll be a little fuzzy. Whatever, right? Like I'm just pulling it off a 16 or 14-year-old video. But Dan Yoder at AT&T Interactive, which like at that time, everyone seemed to be at AT&T Interactive. I was talking to Aaron about that earlier. February 2008, it is unveiled. At this conference, Dan has a fantastic talk about it, about the ambitions, about the future of Ruby Waves. By 2009, it was mostly dead, but it was talked about at 3 different conferences. It was RubyConf, LA, RubyCon, and then maybe Gotham Ruby, one of those. But I'm gonna take, I'm sorry, whatever about time, I'm gonna take a 45-second side note here. Part of the reason I made you laugh was when I was watching Dan's talk, the next room kept laughing. This is 2008. The next room kept laughing, and I could hear it on the audio. If you watch it, you'll see this. Dan Yoder, 2008 RubyConf. And you could tell, like, he's kind of getting a little irritated. Not irritated, but he notices it. And then he just stops. He's like, man, I wonder what that guy's talking about. And like everyone kind of like laughed and stuff. And I was really curious, like, who was that? Who was that in the next room? So I was able to find the old schedule, and I found what slot Dan was in. And I found who else was in the slot, and there was like, again, 4 other speakers. And I replayed their talks at the same timestamps, and I found the one with all the laughter and clapping going on, and it was Jim Wyrick next door. So anyway, I knew this was the right crowd to tell it to. And that was a great talk by Jim too. Anyway, so this is his introduction, but I want to jump in kind of like I did on the last one to a dependency I found really interesting, which was functor. is a foundational dependency to Ruby waves and very much influenced a critical part of how it came together. It was pattern matching. So functor gave you the ability to do pattern matching in a few different ways. It used it as a utility in a specific way, but you could pass functor into your class, and including functor method, and it could, depending on the type of argument, as you see here, do different things, right? So it matched the pattern in that way. You could also pass a block to it, and using this given syntax, again, integer, and then 0 or 1, you do the Fibonacci with it. So again, do different things based on a pattern. And then here it is, being called explicitly with lambdas as well. But the example that they used here was for routing requests. So the shape of your, the shape of your request, the arguments of your request, get, post, whatever, it leveraged functor to be able to handle this, and then you would pass it to where it needed to be with these matches. So let's go to a hello world example with this application. There's a lot of different ways. It's a bit more of from this time, and I kind of think about merb as well. There's components that you can put together in layers. This is a simple one. So you do the map class, which is handling the mapping of our routes, and you put the functor in there on a base get, and it would return, with the query parameter, hello query name. I try to get the hello world for every one of these to just kind of give that to you from the start. But talked a lot about, resource delegation. Like if you looked at the request to tip you off with what resource you wanted to go to, and then do all the other handling for the specifics after that. And everything were ordinary classes. So you could leverage the full power of Ruby, like inheritance, mix-in, modularization, encapsulated code design, with most of what it used. It tried to not make its objects too bizarre or weird or like narrow. So this is a few more slides from that talk. So again, you talk about the map doing introspection, and it can tell, okay, this needs to go to the articles resource, the image resource, the blog resource, the gallery resource. And then it had layers and it had foundations, so it would require, whatever you wanted to include in there. And I know with some frameworks today, we probably don't do that as much. Like in practice, I think a lot of us just, whatever framework we're using, give me everything. My computer can handle it. When I get to like 1 million requests a day, then I can start to think about what I really don't need. But then I'd like to talk about a second dependency here, which was autocode, which was part of this project too, which was better auto-loading in 2008. You can find it, go to Waves autocode, it's still there. Fun fact, it works on Ruby 3 totally fine. You can run this like right now, even on your laptop. So to kind of show you how this works, they want a better way to autocode. So say I have this Schwaderer and fish class and a flop that just returns flip, and I include autocode into it, and I require in the dependency, include it and use this method to auto-load everything in that directory, right? So models, views, controllers, directories, and I want to include autocode, and then when I update this, so you know when it's loaded, right? I put the puts outside of the module. And we see here that I have that put saying I haven't called the model yet, and then when you call the model, it then returns that it's been loaded at this point. So autocode is used for this auto-loading. And it gives you a few other additional methods to reopen classes or modules without clobbering on reload. We have site-work now, or site-vec now, if you're at that conference where they had the proper pronunciation, site-vec. It's massively powerful, and it's everything that you're going to want to be using nowadays. But I had to try and benchmark it because it kept talking about how fast autocode was, right? So I just did this simple thing, and obviously site-vec was 3.6 times faster. And I'd done that on a Ruby 2 version because I was using older Ruby at the time. And then on Ruby 3, it's even faster. It's over 4 times faster. So good work, Schwaderer. I didn't find a secret gem to beat site-vec, so sorry about that. But why not? Make a contrived esoteric framework using all of these tools I share with you today, or I'll do it for you. We'll have OG, we'll have autocode, we'll have functor, and we'll just kind of smush them together. I'll take some things from the next one as well. It had a lofty roadmap, which it never really achieved, right? This was, again, a very quick, 1 year and 8 months that this existed. But similarly, at the end of 2009, you didn't really see it referenced anymore. And I think the reason for that, if you look, the Rails 3 merger with merb was about that time. I think it was announced at end of 2008. I think it was finished at end of 2009. So you saw these other applications that I was researching, and a lot of them kind of fell off in 2009. So I'm wondering if there's community that were very into merb or alternatives to Rails at the time. And maybe there was this sense, well, if these are merging, this is so clearly like a lot of open source work going towards it, we'll drift away from these other tools as well. And I think that's possibly part of what happened. And so we didn't get to realize the full potential of Ruby Waves, but it's still quite usable today. So I'd recommend giving it a look. Final one is Remaze. Anyone heard of Remaze? This is the most usable of the three. It's unveiled in November 2006, marketed to be a middle ground between merb and Rails, and is modular but still MVC, inspired directly by Nitro, and it is not Rails. This is not Rails, okay? So if you use it, you could say you're not using Rails. This is some of their marketing. It had a debut on Ruby Inside in November of 2007. Peter Cooper of Ruby Weekly has been doing this forever, and he keeps all of this. Like, this is some of the best research you could do. Ruby Inside, pre-Ruby Weekly, has all these articles. So this is the one from November 2007. Like I said, it works. If you sit here right now, Ruby version 3.13, gem install Remaze, Remaze create blog, you have a blog. It's pretty darn cool. The Remaze homepage, so the docs, like actually looking at it, it's still up and kicking. So this is quite alive. It barely made the cut for this, but I actually haven't heard the word Remaze but once or twice in my career not doing archaeology. And Ruby Talk in 2009, using them as a reference, alleged that Remaze took up where Nitro left off. And then kind of the last Ruby Talk reference I can find for it is 2012. So you kind of think with a long tail, maybe it had also petered out maybe about 2010, 2011. But if you use it yourself and you're here, I'm not saying it's petered out. Like, that's cool. But it's just not really talked about, and that's okay. I'm going to be conscious of time here, so we can talk more about Remaze later if you like. But I'll try and do this in a couple of minutes. So first off, I'd really like to point to a lot of the things are the same with controllers and MVC. It wanted to be really bare bones, but I like that it uses the map method in the controller. So you're not going to a routes file and back and forth to figure out what is actually going to my controller. You start with the map method and you say what type of request start. So here it'd just be /, right? Is going to go into this controller and be used. I think that's an interesting way to reduce that connasance between the files. And the structure is very traditional with any other MVC project. And the hello world controller is what you expect. And this is a bit more discussion about the view mapping. It supported a lot of template engines, but there's one part I want to focus on. So like a lot of these other projects, it had a core gem, and the core gem was innate. So if you want to do an even smaller version of Remaze, which you can, use innate. Just gem install innate, use that. But the cool thing is it came with its own HTML templater called a Tanny, which was innate backwards. And it alleged that it was like super fast. So you do traditional like Ruby interpolation-y stuff, you know, using your hash and stuff in the file for that. And then you do the markdown we've seen elsewhere with the $R, or to get the raw Ruby in there as well. This is the file. This is it. This is the Ruby templating engine. I was like, dang, if you think you're fast, let's see if you're really fast here. So I found a Honey Badger blog from like a year ago or two. It was ERB versus Haml versus Slam. I'm like, I will use exactly this benchmark with Itani. I think it's fair. It's on Honey Badger. This is definitely going to work. And Itani was, way faster than everybody else. It's faster than ERB by about 4 or 5 times. Unfortunately, I work at Shopify, and Kokuban and Noah Gibbs are on a team near me. And I just was like, hey, Kokuban, I know how you maintain ERB. Could you check my benchmark? And unfortunately, he checked my benchmark, and it was not faster. So I had to do a few things to that benchmark, which I don't have with me today, to make it more fair for ERB. However, there are changes being pushed to Ruby core today that aren't yet released that will make it a bit faster. So it's currently a bit slower than ERB, but it has high hopes and potential. So Itani is really fun to play with. It's not in a gem though. I've extracted it, and I believe I've published it. I believe if you go on Ruby Gems now, you can use it. If I haven't, I'm sorry. It's on a gist at least. It's somewhere. That's the one thing I didn't really think about for this talk. But its feasibility in 2022 here with my last few seconds, this could be the biggest winner because I can run it on an M1 with Ruby 2 with little to no trouble. The innate core lets you strip even more out, and Itani is worth pursuing, although I'm suspicious in a real world environment it may not be the fastest Ruby templater. Yes, speaker notes. I have gemified it, so enjoy the gem. So many more. Here's like 9 Ruby web frameworks I didn't cover. So there's a lot more for you to check. And We's not even on the list, so there's even more. So my question for you today is, what will you build? Now that you've seen all of this that was existing in the community, you're all creative people. There's nothing stopping us from making esoteric web frameworks, having our own opinions, pushing these things to the web. And I really look forward to see what kind of things you could go out and build or even pair with me on if you'd like. Let's connect. Follow me in Schwad, whatever. Like you'll find me at some point somewhere. Thank you so much for listening to my talk. I really appreciate it. Enjoy RubyConf. Thank you.